Hello, everyone. Welcome to this fourth in a series of webinars on COVID-19 and its impact on the rule of law, hosted by the World Justice Project, and in this case, by our partners CIVICUS and the International Service for Human Rights. I'm Ted Picone. I'm the Chief Engagement Officer for the World Justice Project, and very happy to welcome you all to today's program. The context for our discussion is one that, as you all know, is still raging. COVID-19 has been with us for a year now and looks to be with us for several more months, if not longer. And we know that this has had a dramatic impact on a range of rule of law issues, including today's topic, fundamental rights and non-discrimination. So the focus of our work on this COVID-19 rule of law relationship is, number one, draw attention to the real gaps and problems, but also think about both short-term and longer-term responses, and so that we're building back better, as the phrase has become so widely used. But I think an important one, that this is both a crisis but an opportunity to fix and improve and reform our justice systems and other rule of law institutions and processes along the way. Our World Justice Challenge is a way to identify and recognize the most innovative projects that are responding to this crisis. And we've launched this challenge last fall. We've received 425 applications from around the world. We're very excited about that. We're now in the process of, the applications are closed. We're now in the process of reviewing those applications with our partners in order to reach a group of 30 finalists. And these 30 finalists will have an opportunity to share their work on our website through our knowledge platform, which will be launched in a little while, and through various webinars and other presentations that we'll be organizing in March and April. Winners will be announced in May. A panel of eminent judges will get to work in choosing them. There'll be 5 winners, and they will each receive $20,000. And a 6th winner will be chosen by a popular vote among our network. And we're very happy to invite you all to participate in that voting process, and you'll hear more from us along the way. We're recording today's session, and the recording will be circulated to everyone who registered. I think we have over 350 people who have registered for today's discussion. If you have any questions or comments, and I'm glad to see people are already filling up the chat box, please introduce yourself or share resources, pose your questions and comments, and we will do our best to get to them towards the end of the program, which is just for 60 minutes. So we'll try to be efficient and get across as many views as we can on this important issue. So let me introduce the panel. Today we'll be hearing from Mandeep Tiwana. Mandeep is the Chief Programs Officer for CIVICUS, a global leader in defending and promoting civil society's rights and roles in public life. We also will hear from Tess McAvoy, who is the New York Co-Director and Legal Counsel for International Service for Human Rights, an NGO specializing in protecting the voice of human rights defenders around the world. And our third speaker is Maja Daruwala, a longtime expert and advocate for human rights and justice in the Commonwealth, and currently editor-in-chief of the India Justice Report. She's with us today from New Delhi, which also happens to be India Republic Day, and some interesting events going on there. So let's start with a first round of questions that look at what is the problem? What are the problems we're seeing today as a result of the dramatic effects of COVID-19. We have produced a policy brief that's available on our website, and I'll ask my colleagues to post it in the chat box that examines a number of areas of concern when it comes to fundamental rights and non-discrimination. Everything from the effects on prisoners, of course, freedom of assembly and association, effects on women and gender-based violence, right to privacy, are just some examples. So what I want to hear from our panelists is what are the key problems they see from their perspective. How have these problems evolved over the course of the crisis? And any specific examples that you'd like to highlight for us. So why don't we start with Mandeep?
Thank you, Ted, and many thanks to the World Justice Project for hosting this conversation. And I'm also honored to be on with such a great panel. So the thing with COVID-19 was that whatever the existing challenges that were there in society, they were accelerated and they were exacerbated. The fault lines were exacerbated. So if people were impoverished, they felt the weight of the pandemic much more. If they were excluded, the exclusion accelerated in the context of the pandemic. And with regards to fundamental rights, there's three things that I wanted to highlight and share with our participants today. One is that in the early days of the pandemic, we saw that there was an increase in censorship. Governments were scrambling to respond to the crisis. And in doing so, they wanted to put their best foot forward. So you found that in some countries, information about the government response to the pandemic was scrubbed from the internet. In other places, we found that there were directives that were issued to the media not to report on the spread of the pandemic. In other places, the governments even issued orders saying that anybody who's spreading fake news or information about the pandemic, they would be prosecuted and so on. So there was a chilling of information and through censorship. Our political leaders were taking decisions that were going to impact our lives. Yet people did not know the basis for which these decisions were taken. So that is really a really challenging aspect that we saw in the early days of the pandemic. Also, the pandemic was used as an opportunity to put in place states of emergency. So countries that already had states of emergency, like Egypt, extended their states of emergency. And then there were other countries where states of emergency were imposed, which led to another set of challenges. So the second issue that exacerbated during the pandemic was the repression of any dissenting voices of activists, and also an enhance in the repressive capacities of law enforcement agencies. So a lot of law enforcement agencies, as emergency powers were put in place, as states tried to balance public safety concerns with civil liberties, a lot of law enforcement agencies exceeded their remit. So, for example, in the Philippines, people were put into dog cages for moving. In Kenya, we saw that people were being caned for violating curfew, rights. In India, which had a sudden imposition of a lockdown, as in a very grand and dramatic way, which caused immeasurable suffering to ordinary people, and particularly those at the bottom end of the economic ladder. We found that law enforcement agencies actually engage in lots of cruel and degrading punishment for people they perceive to be violating lockdown orders by making them, sit up and down, or do all sorts of things in public, and while they were beating them. So that was a big challenge. But in other places, activists who were posting information or truth about what was going on, like in Vietnam, they were summoned to police stations. They were coerced from sharing their views about what's happening, and that was a challenge. The third thing I wanted to just highlight in the context of the pandemic was surveillance. So many governments use the excuse of the pandemic about public safety concerns to ramp up their surveillance capacities. You found a whole spawning of apps in the name of contact tracing. From Israel to Singapore, people's movements were being monitored very closely, and we found that that became a serious challenge, which is going to stay with us. So I would say looking back now at the year gone by, we found that after 9/11, there was a knee-jerk reaction, when governments reacted to the war on terror and normalized torture and they normalized extraordinary renditions. One of the outcomes that might linger on from this pandemic is surveillance and censorship. And our research at CIVICUS found that at the end of 2020, 87% of the world's population were living in countries with very poor civic space conditions. So where the civic freedoms of expression, association, peaceful assembly, which are part of customary international law, included in the constitutions of most countries, were being denied to people. In fact, a quarter of the world's population live in countries which are totally closed civic space, where conditions are so terrible that anybody who speaks against the government is tortured, put into prison, killed, and really has no space. And this swath of countries is large. It extends from China to Cuba, and there's a whole number of countries in the Middle East and North Africa, from Syria to Iran to Saudi Arabia, and Turkmenistan, and more, where conditions are very, very serious. So all in all, the pandemic was not a good year for the exercise of fundamental freedoms. It was not a good year for the demonstration of democratic rights. Right-wing populists got into a pact with old school authoritarians, and they started to mimic each other's behaviors.
Thank you, Mandeep. I mean, this is a story that is not surprising when you think about the state of the civil society freedoms and space and the rule of law situations around the world. We're already at a bad point before the pandemic hit. And so we've referred to this as a twin crisis, a rule of law, human rights crisis, and a public health crisis that have made both worse. Tess, can we turn to you and maybe tell us a little bit about what you're seeing on impacts on specific vulnerable groups, women, minorities, LGBT groups, et cetera?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. So what I wanted to discuss today was kind of the impact that we're seeing on human rights defenders and on activists, and then in doing so, to speak a little bit more about some specific groups of activists. So as Mandeep has really clearly laid out, the pandemic is a global emergency with far-reaching impact on fundamental rights, and as well including social, economic, and ecological impacts for us all. And the pandemic, but as also the state's responses to it, has presented various new challenges and threats for those that are standing up and defending human rights. And these threats are new threats that go beyond existing and long documented trends of attacks against defenders and attacks against activists and their fundamental rights. So many countries that we've seen have taken steps beyond what is necessary or proportionate to respond to the health crisis. An example in terms of numbers, in Guatemala, in the kind of first part of this year, there were 405 attacks reported against activists. And the year before, there was 494 in the entire year. And so they were seeing a real ramp up in March. So what exactly are the impacts we're seeing on defenders during the pandemic? Firstly, and as Mandeep alluded to as well, many defenders are exposed to risks that stem from structural inequality, discrimination because of who they are. So whether they're women, Indigenous or Afro-descendant people, migrants, refugees, or LGBTI people, or belong to other groups that are systematically discriminated against and marginalized. So the pandemic has only exposed and deepened existing discrimination, existing violence, and other violations. It's exacerbated systems of oppression. There have been increased threats against women defenders. There's increased attacks against women defenders. There's been an increase in domestic violence, physical attacks and killings, online harassment. Women defenders, as well as LGBTI rights defenders, have lost their livelihoods. They've lost access to health services, and they've been excluded from participating in pandemic responses. So one example I wanted to refer to was a women's rights defender in Cameroon who told us that she's witnessed a notable increase in intimate partner violence due to lockdowns, and gender-based violence survivors were left without access to safe houses and shelters, psychological aid, and emergency treatment due to state-led closure of community health centres, as well as restrictions on their movement. So beyond the specific impact on vulnerable groups and defenders representing vulnerable groups, COVID has also been used by some states as a pretext to roll back human rights protections and to reduce civil society space and increase attacks on defenders. So Mandeep spoke to this already, so I just wanted to add a couple of other examples of what we're seeing around the globe. So the Filipino government has, in addition to using these dog cages to detain curfew violators, we've seen killings in the so-called war on drugs intensified, as did unnecessary arrests. Governments were using red baiting of rights defenders to put them at greater risk of deadly attack, and the media came under renewed attack. In Hungary, there was increased government power to rule decree legislation, and this was contravening the right to freedom of expression and included provisions on false news. And there was more online threats to journalists and smear campaigns. Healthcare workers were also fearful of speaking out due to retaliation. The other kind of points I also wanted to mention was, which Mandeep also alluded to as well, in terms of crackdown on defenders for speaking out in relation to pandemic responses. So we've seen across many countries that legislation has been introduced with blanket provisions regarding dissemination of information based on kind of vague concepts of false news. We saw in China, independent journalists and activists were harassed for sharing information on the violence of the virus on social media. In Poland, activists were arresting for putting out posters accusing the government of manipulating the statistics around COVID. In Russia, there have been reports of reprisals faced by healthcare workers and defenders for speaking out about the handling of the pandemic. And in Nicaragua, healthcare workers who raised the alarm on lack of personal protective equipment faced reprisals, dismissals, harassment. So in addition to this, we've also seen defenders that have been detained solely for their work to protect human rights have been excluded from release, where some measures were taken to decongest prisons. And also defenders at higher risk countries where killings and wider crackdowns were previously ongoing are only more at risk, where we've seen in Colombia, for example, in the first few months of the pandemic, killings soared, and attacks by security forces were also reported in Honduras.
Wow, it's a pretty grim story, and such a diversity of countries that are dealing with it in this more repressive way. Maja, can we turn to you now, and in particular the work you've been doing on the Indian justice system, and of course, you know, the courts have an important role to play in upholding rights. Turn it over to you. You're on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. So in many ways, the things that Tess was alluding to and Mandeep was mentioning, all of it is applicable to South Asia and certainly to India. So actually, you know, any analysis of what has been happening in the last 12 months requires a sort of analysis of the pandemic effect itself, as well as what was there before. So in terms of India, the pandemic came suddenly. Hardly anybody knew about it. And then suddenly we knew about it and nothing else because of this sudden lockdown, which Mandeep alluded to, which was at 4 hours notice. And it was complete. So the disruption was huge. And when we're talking about civil liberties, you have heard Mandeep and Tess talking about it, and all of that is reflected in India, undoubtedly, and in spades, if you'd like to say that. But the disruption was huge, and if you imagine the workforce, 83% of it is in the informal sector. 92% work without the benefits of leave, days off, insurance, minimum wage. So these are daily wagers. So when you shut down, that means there's no daily wage, there's no home remittances, even very low rents in tenements, etc., can't be paid. So all these people started to walk home, and there was very little assistance, in fact, no assistance in the beginning, given to these people to get home. and there was a rush for every kind of transportation, and when people couldn't find it, they walked home. Now that the pandemic is easing up, they are perforce, because they have no other means, having to come back to the cities. Some will come back, some will stay at home, some will get minimal social protection from the social protection nets that there are there. So the fundamental right to food, the right to education, the right to livelihood, the life to dignity has all shrunk, but it is shrunk at such a large extent among so many such large numbers of people who actually probably don't even know that they have them, but their conditions are going to worsen so much. And recently, all of this was very much underlined by a report by Oxfam, which came out only yesterday. Which came out, I think, only yesterday or the day before, called the inequality virus. And the numbers there are amazing, and they speak so much to how the virus is affecting simply the ability to live and to have livelihoods. So in this connection, and please somebody watch the time and tell me if we're getting late.
1 or 2 minutes.
1 or 2 minutes. In this connection, I'd like to also talk about two things. One is the structural weaknesses of all of the protection machineries that should have been there. With the police, they treated it like a law and order situation rather than protecting people and assisting them. The courts shut down. In the complete lockdown, the courts shut down. So you lost a remedy, a platform for remedy. And at the same time, all the things that Mandeep, etc., were alluding to were there on the ground. The other thing was, the other platform that is always available to individuals in a democratic country is media or the social networks and the social media. But here too, you found that the media was very much in India, the media, the power elite, and social media and the populist sentiment is not particularly wedded to civil liberties. They see it as an obstacle to progress. They see it as an obstacle to, as somebody said, there's too much democracy. Of course, there is also tremendous resistance to these kinds of ideas, but there's no platform to take your resistance to when civil society is being shuttered, human rights defenders are being put in jail, dissent is not being tolerated, peaceful protest is also not being tolerated. And I particularly put the accent on peaceful protest. And one last thing that I would like to flag is that the situation of women, we haven't talked about the situation of minorities, and the situation of minorities even before the pandemic was that of a public tolerance for discrimination, which should have been ameliorated by the courts and all of the protective agencies that are there, the National Human Rights Commission and state human rights commissions, but these have not performed to the effect that they should. And now coming back a little bit to women, I think that we are seeing, or we are going to see, in this diminution of personal liberty and freedom, a tremendous step back for women, the women's movement. Because the women's movement is all about non-discrimination and liberty. Liberty of person, liberty of thought. And I was going to give you a really good example of this, but I know that we don't have the time.
Well,
and as far as remedies are concerned, I think we'll come back to it.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you for all that. And we get a very strong sense of what a dire situation we're in and what a direct effect this has had frontally on human rights, but also in the entire environment that supports the ecosystem for human rights. But let's talk more positively about remedies. And I'm thinking about, your own organizations and your partners and other examples that you may have in mind where we actually have seen some response that's appropriate, that maybe even is positive by states or civil society, by the private sector. Can you share with us, I know CIVICUS, you've done a report recently that identifies a number of ways that civil society has been very resilient in its response. Over to you, Mandeep.
So the story of civil society in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic really is a story of extraordinary, courage and resilience. And as Maya was saying, one of the things that happened because of the lockdown in India was migrant workers and people who were daily wage laborers. They really faced the brunt of this. The civil society in India responded immediately by providing them, the needs for their basic nutrition, but also for basic necessities, that would keep them going, and shelter. So this is just one example which is replicated around the world. Domestic violence was a big issue that that happened due to pandemic lockdown. Civil society organizations around the world, in fact, set up helplines so that this pandemic within the pandemic could be addressed. There are examples in countries like Cameroon where civil society is being attacked and is being vilified and so on, where civil society actually worked to distribute hand sanitizers, distribute masks, and in other places, civil society actually worked with governments, despite the fact that many governments call civil society as disruptive and acting at the behest of foreign forces and so on, and vilification, stigmatization that takes place. Civil society worked with governments to counter disinformation about the virus, to actually share credible information on what people should and should not do and what the impacts were. There are so many stories in our report, Solidarity in the Time of COVID-19, that, about how civil society really stepped up to the plate. They served local communities, from helping the aged to providing educational, tools for children who were impacted by the virus. And most importantly, I think I would just like to emphasize that civil society did this very quickly without a profit motive and had the trust of local communities because of the work that they had already done. It wasn't a parachute helicopter, approach by a logistics agency coming there and trying to solve a problem. The other issue that I wanted to just emphasize a little bit was that that civil society's morale also remained high. A lot because of the pandemic. In many parts of the world, there were public protests, movements, demonstrations that a lot of authoritarian state apparatuses found a good opportunity to shut them down. But civil society continued to organize. So, for example, in Brazil, where the response of the government has been cruel to the pandemic, civil society organizations put up 1,000 crosses in front of prominent government buildings to demonstrate the inadequacy of the official response. In the Netherlands, climate protesters put their shoes, when they couldn't organize publicly, they put their shoes in public squares to show the need to act in support of climate justice. In many places, there were balcony protests for gender justice and for rights of LGBTQI communities, where people banged their pots and pans. So the civil society solidarity continued. And here in the United States, when a delinquent president continued to engage in race baiting, civil society organizations came out with the Black Lives Matter protest, which had an impact around the world and also led to the vote being brought out in extraordinary numbers and leading to a change in administration.
Now, those are very powerful examples, and I think resilience is the big headline. Civil society is not shut down. Actually, in some ways, has come up with creative ways for direct assistance to people, but also in the voice and the advocacy role that they have played. Tess, do you want to give us some examples from the areas you're working on?
Yeah, for sure. I think I want to start by stealing Mandeep's terms courage and resilience, because I think that really kind of carries across everything that we're seeing happening. And so I wanted to speak a little bit to some examples of some of the role that defenders have played within their response, because there's been a need to. Like, states haven't stood up and kind of done what they'd needed to do, and there's been a gap that defenders have had to fill. And so, you know, they've had to shift their activities and focus and respond to urgent needs. So defenders working in public health, research, healthcare, and journalism have stepped into the public debate to raise alarm and inform the public about COVID. Their work's been essential in demanding states provide accessible and reliable information in an objective and transparent manner. They've also raised the alarm when state-led measures were damaging or inadequate. They've provided information on COVID-19, especially when that information is lacking and contradictory. They've denounced the lack of adequate prevention measures and health services in protective equipment. They've also provided humanitarian aid for groups that are marginalized, discriminated against, and disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So one of the things, you know, we mentioned at the start and we're continuing to see is the way in which this pandemic is disproportionately impacting certain communities. So shifting from rights advocacy into humanitarian services and assistance. We've got partners in Liberia that were shifting what they were doing to essentially just drop off and provide food, really simple food to their communities, because they just had no access to food or healthcare. Defenders have also denounced the pushback on human rights under the cover of emergency legislation that we spoke about earlier. And defenders, including women's rights defenders, LGBTI defenders, anti-racism campaigners, environmental and land activists and refugees, have spoken out when COVID responses were having a disproportionate impact and a discriminatory impact on certain populations and communities, and took action to then further support their communities. So not only this is kind of that shift in what's happening, but also this has been particularly challenging for defenders and activists and civil society when funding has been restricted so heavily. So we've seen kind of a lack of funding across the board, and some partners that we work with that are focusing specifically on trans and intersex rights have had zero funding support throughout the entire COVID pandemic, but have continued to do their work to support their communities and their and each other. I wanted to just spend a moment also speaking about multilateral institutions. So my organisation, ISHR, works to support defenders to engage with the UN and regional human rights bodies, and as well to strengthen those bodies. And so despite its shortcomings, the UN does provide a space for accountability and representation. But in order for it to do that, it's essential that affected communities, that women defenders, LGBTI defenders and others can meaningfully participate in those spaces. And so as a global coalition throughout 2020, we saw so many things happening by civil society and defenders in relation to multilateral spaces such as the UN. There was governments being lobbied, there were joint statements being presented, joint letters to governments setting out specific measures to ensure participation was protected at the UN, and developing guidelines and recommendations again around that protection of civil society space in those UN discussions. But despite this, we saw that civil society participation with key UN human rights bodies and mechanisms drastically decreased in 2020 due to COVID. And so, you know, this is really concerning, as states have an obligation both to support the civil society engagement at the UN, and even when there is no pandemic, it's always under attack by certain states. And beyond this, states should be held accountable for using the crisis as an excuse to restrict civil society participation at the UN further. So, you know, trying to kind of flip back to talking about remedies and some positive developments, there were some. So one example is that national NGOs were able to deliver video statements at the Human Rights Council, which is the main human rights body of the UN. So it did enable kind of more ensuring that people affected by human rights violations could speak at the council when travel was restricted and when restrictions on access were being carried out. And while it's obviously not a replacement for in-person participation, it did create some progress in that regard. And finally, one other element I wanted to mention was we did also see some UN experts taking some really positive steps. So the independent expert on violence and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity released the Aspire guidelines, which were essentially recommendations for states on how they could essentially kind of manage or develop a COVID-19 response that would be free from discrimination against LGBTQA persons. And there was also a joint statement made by a number of UN experts in this regard.
Great, that's very specific. I'm glad you touched on what's happening at the international level as well. And you know, the move to our online lives can be used effectively in lots of different ways. And I'm glad to hear video statements are now allowed. Of course, it does raise a huge set of questions, which I'm already seeing in the chat box about internet access and the right to information through those means, which is a huge gap around the world. And we'll want to talk about that along the way. Maja, can we turn to you and hear a bit more about some of the remedies that you're encouraged by?
The remedies, or did you want to talk about the civil society space? I beg your pardon.
I focus on remedies generally.
Okay. Well, like you said just now, which was that ecosystems are not conducive to supporting human rights. And the remedies in India that I see, and perhaps I'm talking about all of South Asia, is that the institutions that should be there to protect rights or to uphold constitutional conditionalities and imperatives are themselves weak. They're weak structurally. There's huge amounts of vacancies, training is poor, infrastructure is poor, diversity is not there. And on this, you very kindly mentioned the report that I am the chief editor of, and it's going to be launched day after tomorrow, the new version. And we are seeing that very little has been done over the last year and a half to remedy this. Some improvements are there, but just going back to some of the courage that I see of civil society groups, etc. Individual courage have been extraordinary. In the absence of platform, in the absence of remedial institutions, especially the Human Rights Commission, both the national and the state Human Rights Commission have really been missing in action to a great deal. And there was much more that they could have done. The students, despite the threat that they have been active. And it's interesting to see that when you talk about the response of civil society to the crisis, where the response has been humanitarian, which is what Mandeep was talking about, there is a welcome for it, a limited welcome for it, by state power. But when it comes to advocacy and upholding accountability, transparency, participation, dissent, inclusion, and there is a questioning, then there is very little tolerance for it. At the same time, because the election process and because the political process is still alive and well, there are many groupings who have come together. You won't normally call them civil society, but they come together to then be part of a counter to the dominant narrative. So I think that's really how it is playing out. Independent media is enormously courageous in a corner, but still enormously courageous. Then you have things like people who call out fake news, but they call it out every single day. And then you've got the right to information activists. They are across all the country. And despite something like 41 or 42 fatalities in the last year and a half, they still continue to expose wrongdoing. But as I said, it looks to me, standing over here, and perhaps I'm too close to it, it looks fragmented rather than that I can point to a universal solidarity. Mm-hmm. So the need of the hour seems to be to come together, but the lockdown, the disparate languages, the disparate interests, etc., are making this more difficult to do.
So I want to encourage our audience to please join in the chat and pose your questions in the Q&A box. We will get to you in about a few minutes, about 5 minutes. I want to just do one more round with our speakers on kind of key takeaways and recommendations for action. If you were to identify one or two most important priorities to deal with this set of problems for both states and other rule of law actors, what would they be? Mandeep.
Thanks. So I'm going to be brief, but I wanted to share 5 priorities that we've identified in our State of Civil Society report, which is developed with civil society activists around the world. So the first thing is we really need to rethink how our economies are structured. Oxfam's inequality report has made that clear, that billionaires have profited while people at the bottom rung of the economic ladder have been evicted. They've faced hunger, starvation, all sorts of deprivation. So we really need to think about how our economies are structured. In the past few years, governments have been privatizing and outsourcing their basic responsibilities, and there needs to be some sort of reorientation, a rethink on how our economies are structured. And here, governments need to take responsibility for healthcare bills, for example. Those who had the privilege to get private healthcare are actually facing bankruptcy. They don't know how to pay those bills. And in countries where the government healthcare system has been good, those countries have done better. So we really need to think about social security nets. We need to think about, even innovative things like universal basic income, and more importantly, progressive taxation, to reduce this inequality, which is a risk to all of us. The second point that's come out from our research is that we need to focus on the most excluded first. And I know that Tess has spoken about this. And any policy making, I would say we shouldn't be building back better, because what we had behind was still very much unfair. So we need to think about building better forward. And here we really need to focus on excluded minorities, disadvantaged people, LGBTQI communities, and people who are barely getting by. And we need to design our social structures, our economic policies around them, so that they can be brought into the economic framework and the development framework that's there. The third issue that emerged was we really also need to reorient ourselves towards safeguarding biodiversity and climate justice. Over the past few years, we've seen forest fires from the Amazon to Australia. It's something that is going to impact future generations. It's also going to create mass migrations and conflict, as we are seeing in parts of North Africa over water and so on. So there needs to be a reorientation, a respect for the Paris Agreement, and for all countries to do their bit on safeguarding biodiversity. The fourth point is really about international cooperation. The pandemic has shown us how a challenge in one part of the world can so easily cross over into another part of the world. And international institutions are going to be critical if we want to build better forward. We need to make sure that they are resourced, but also they are insulated from the actions of authoritarian states or leaders who are trying to use them and repurpose them for their own benefit. So we really need to invest in international institutions, and here we also need to think of multilateralism not just as an economic issue. There are some governments that think of multilateralism as just economic certainty, but human rights need to go alongside that, along with climate justice. So we really need to reorient ourselves back to our norms, which will help us all live together. And lastly, I just want to emphasize the point about rule of law and democratic rights and civil liberties, and I think Maja spoke about this too, how important it is to a country like India. Both of us are celebrating Republic Day today. It's the day of the day India's constitution was established. It's the constitution that creates inclusivity. It reflects the finer values of our freedom struggle of liberty and fraternity and equality. It's a work in progress, realizing those values. But That is really absolutely critical because there needs to be civic space. People need to be able to shape the decisions that impact their lives. They need to be able to reform social, political, and economic structures. If we don't have civic freedoms, if we don't have civic space, our democratic institutions are not going to be able to function properly, and our governments are going to falter. So on that note, let me hand it back to you.
All right. Well, Mandeep, that was a very comprehensive set of recommendations. I appreciate it. I particularly appreciate the building better forward phrasing, if I had it right. I think the idea that building back sounds to some people like we're moving back to something that was already unfair and not working. And so I take your point on that. Tess, I'm curious to hear what you think also about Mandeep's point about multilateralism, and if you see a role for the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, in this building forward agenda, and any other points you want to make, just a couple of key recommendations and takeaways.
For sure. So I have many recommendations written down here. I'm going to kind of sift through them and just try and pick out a few that I think kind of fit along those that Mandeep has mentioned. So firstly, just to say 100% agree with everything that Mandeep has said. And there are so many ways in which we can kind of look forward from here. And there's also a number of, a lot of work that's been done by human rights organizations and others in terms of how to move forward as well. And so I think there's kind of a lot of literature out there for us all to look at. In saying all that, I'm going to try and pick up a couple of pieces and not look at them all. So one of the things, any action to address the pandemic and can move forward needs to be comprehensive and systematic. And it's really integral that it applies both a feminist, human rights-based and intersectional lens. So centered on non-discrimination, participant and empowerment of vulnerable communities. Mandeep also alluded to this, but it's really important that those people are in the room. In terms of some recommendations for states, ensuring that they are complying with international human rights laws and standards when implementing emergency measures, when going forward and looking at other measures to address the pandemic, and that they're upholding obligations to healthcare and to also ensure kind of transparency and genuine commitment and support for multilateralism. So I think this responds a bit to your point there, is that making sure that commitment does exist for multilateral institutions, making sure that civil society participation in those institutions is protected. So it's in these times where these kind of institutions like the UN are even more critical, where national mechanisms aren't providing support for their communities. And states, one, shouldn't use the pandemic to restrict genuine access for civil society, and need to make sure that it's protected and those inputs are coming out. So there's, as I said before, there's been a number of different calls, recommendations made to various bodies within the UN. You mentioned the SDGs, and in relation to the SDGs, the high-level political forum, there was calls for civil society about how they could best engage within that mechanism. I talked about video statements before, but there's so many other spaces. The UN's made up of so many different bodies where we've just seen a restriction on civil society, but civil society is there in each of those spaces, kind of at the door, ready to engage more. And so states need to really listen and ensure those voices are heard. And just to maybe one or two more,
just 1 minute more.
Okay, great. Just to kind of recognize and protect and enable defenders to do their work. We're seeing crackdowns, but we need to think of it the other way. Like, where we need to recognize them, we need to enable them, we need to speak publicly in support of them, and ensure they're in the design, implementation, evaluation of government processes to the pandemic. Like, if they're not in the room, how are we knowing how these are impacting other people?
Yeah.
I'm going to stop.
Yeah, because we have a lot of questions now in the queue, but inclusion is a key point in the building forward. Maja, particularly your work on the justice system reforms, what do you think are one or two key recommendations for action?
Thank you, Ted. Both my colleagues on the panel have spoken, in such wide terms of international kinds of things. And it's hard. I'm going to be very higgledy-piggledy because some of the stuff is long-term and some of it is very, very short-term and immediate. One of the things that I really wanted to happen in national setting, and this could be any national setting, is for the justice sector, the courts, the police, the prisons, the legal aid, all of it to be known as or to be designated as an essential service, just like you would have an essential service like the fire service or food or hospitals. And that the availability, so if you designate it an essential service, then you start to think about how do we fund it, where does it go, where does it stay. So the localization, just now in big countries like India and in areas where there's a tremendous gap between the urban and the rural dispensation of justice and administration of justice and access to justice. So this has to be also cured. Then the people who actually, the duty holders, how is their orientation? For instance, are they oriented in the Constitution so that there is a language which they can speak, which is common across these structures? Even that is not there. Training, reorientation, all of this is required. And this part, the training and the reorientation into constitutional mindset, is an immediate thing you can do, an instant thing you can do, because it's all about transparency, accountability, participation, and non-discrimination. So how do you get that in a society which has been structured on the basis of status, whether it's women, whether it's caste? So how do you get that? I mean, it's been long years, it's 70 years, more than 70 years, but we haven't done enough to get this into the traditional so that people know there is a different set of values from which you can choose. You may have your lived values, you may have your traditional values, but legal literacy of the Constitution, of the processes of the court will tell you about it. Then, of course, there's all sorts of other things, but I don't want to take time. In terms of the safety of women is an extremely useful core which advocates can use, because there is universal agreement that women must be safe. And there has been too much violence against women in this country and all across South Asia. For this is a very important, and governments are unable to be anything but defensive when they cannot do it. So that is one organizational tool that is possible. The other thing, last thing I want to talk about, as I said, is very higgledy-piggledy, is the international commitment of the commitment of the international community to human rights as the coin of foreign policy has diminished, especially in the last 4 years with your Trump administration. So, and you know what has taken center stage is economic prosperity, and that too not of everybody, but of some. But I think if you come back to internationalism, where human rights becomes a center stone for negotiation, discussion, and is widely perceived to be something that can make you legitimate and can validate your inclusion into the virtuous circle of international community, then I think that would be a great help nationally also.
These are a really outstanding set of ideas and recommendations. Thank you for all of that. I'm going to ask Joel Martinez to join us and summarize some of the questions. Maybe if you could pick 2 or 3 that have popped up, and then we do a final round for our 3 guests to respond to those.
Perfect. Thanks, Ted. And thanks to everyone who's asked a question in the Q&A or in the chat. Lots of great questions came in. We'll only have time for a few, and I'm going to paraphrase a few of them that have come in. Maybe starting here, picking up on sort of Maya's last point, we've gotten a lot of questions about protections for marginalized populations. What are some of the best protections out there? Who's getting this right? What can be done, particularly around protections for women, migrant workers, and folks in the informal economy? So that's one of the themes that has come through. The second theme that has come through here is around digital rights and online access. So during the pandemic, we have seen that being able to access the internet is essential in many cases. And there's a question on how can we increase and address the digital divide that has sort of become very important during the pandemic. And also sort of on the flip side, what can civil society and governments do to address issues where internet services are suspended? So another question around digital rights. And then finally, a question here on combating misinformation. So we have a question about what can be done about misinformation being provided about the pandemic, particularly by either state actors or by private individuals or organizations providing misinformation. So I'll turn it back over to you, Ted. Those are a few of the key themes we're seeing in the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Joel. Maybe we'll now reverse the order and turn to Maja first, then Tess, then Mandeep, and respond to any of these questions as best you can in 1 or 2 minutes. Maja.
I think, you see, you can only work within the space you have. And you can only work where there is a powerful state and the asymmetry of power is so great. When you say something like, what can I do about internet shutdowns? You can take it to court. In each case, you can take it to court. In each case, you can say it was illegitimate. In each case, you can say that my freedoms were trampled upon. But if the court system itself is delayed, and there are something like 40 million cases pending, and you haven't heard habeas corpus cases for 6 and 8 and 10 weeks, what to mention months, then where is your relief going to be? I'm just being realistic. I'm not being depressive, but I'm being realistic. So combating misinformation, if there is space for independent media, there is any amount of people and any amount of, I think in most countries, even extremely poor countries, there is enough intellectual curiosity, etc., to combat it, provided there is a space and a platform to combat it. And the first question was about women. What was that question? Whether, I can't remember the question, honestly.
Well, I think women and other marginalized communities are their special, well, I think you've really responded to that quite well when you talked about prioritizing.
Even marginalized community in law, if you look at your constitution in almost every country that I am seeing on the list of participants, you have got a constitution which protects minorities' rights. But you have to have the mechanisms which do it, and do it vigorously, and do it consistently, and don't swerve from that commitment. And then you can get some play.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, is protest, peaceful protest. But again, the space on the ground has to be available. And the danger and the risk cannot be so great that you simply are paralyzed into doing nothing.
Thank you. Tess?
Okay, I'm going to try and respond briefly and add a couple of points to each of those. So in terms of protections for marginalized populations, kind of the key thing, and I think it's been a really key theme coming out of this conversation is, inclusion. And so listen and be led by marginalized populations. What we're seeing now is not new. It's not that this discrimination didn't exist. It's that the pandemic has amplified the existing situation, and that certain populations and vulnerable communities, there's a disproportionate impact on them. And so we really need to address these root causes. And the way to do so is to do genuinely and with genuine consultation and be led by those populations. In terms of digital rights, I think that this is a huge, huge issue. And there's so many different elements of that. I've got 2 very short points that don't kind of address the issue, but it's some things like looking to international NGOs, organizations like mine have a role to play to bridge the voices of national defenders that have limited access to the internet and bring those voices out and kind of present them at the UN or in other spaces. So, really ensuring that we're doing what we should be doing and bringing those voices out. Another is, bringing this information to funders. So funders need to know what's happening at the national level and kind of explaining to funders, this grant we're applying for now, it's really important that this has some information, some money in there for internet access, because access has been restricted for like all these general elements that would be assumed to have at certain levels that don't exist. So kind of informing and making sure that communication happens. And then finally, on this question on misinformation, really continuing to call out states on their actions and highlighting the voices of defenders that are doing so. When you're hearing about defenders that are talking out and speaking out on what's being done by governments, or where there's been claims where defenders have been imprisoned or attacked because they're spreading false information, stand up and speak out and amplify those voices, because they're the ones that are at risk for bringing this truth to light. And continue to do it in multilateral spaces as well, so we can acknowledge that, this is what's happening in this country, and the rest of the world need to know about this to try and put additional pressure on them to ideally stop.
Thank you. We have a minute left, Mandeep, for you to summarize or like maybe pick out one final point you want to make here.
So very quickly, the rights that we have offline, we also have them online. So, our right to tell our truth, our right not to be subjected to hatred, that line exists online. So we need to use the systems, as Maya said, but we also need some norm setting. So the UN Secretary General has just appointed an envoy on technology, and technology and civic freedoms is going to be, a new area of elaboration from the UN at least. So that's something that we need to look at and see if there's norms we need so that governments cannot engage in blanket shutdowns, or private sector companies cannot, expunge our right to speak and or to be against being abused. So the thing about I think the issue on gender justice and rights of marginalized people, we have Agenda 2030. It's a comprehensive agenda. It's 17 goals. Every country, whether they're in the global north or the global south, have committed to this. We need to infuse Agenda 2030 with the human rights-based approach. And I think that is absolutely critical. Unfortunately, a lot of governments are approaching Agenda 2030 more in an MDG mindset, but it's a rights-based agenda. It's a social justice agenda. And we need to see it as that. And if all governments play their part and people help their governments and hold them to account to do that, I think we can get some progress. On the last bit about countering disinformation, I know the Tess has already mentioned a few points there. I would just say organize, organize, organize. Let's call it out. It's our responsibility as civil society to expose these charlatans who are using information and disinformation and are trying to use propaganda as a tool to advance their narrow-minded agendas. Ultimately, the people will win, and that's something that we all have to have faith in.
There are so many rich and important points made in this last hour. Thank you all so very much. I think the biggest takeaway for me is such an obvious one, but one we just have to keep focused on like a laser beam, which is the basic principle of equality and non-discrimination. I mean, that's the principle that's most threatened and at the root cause of so many of these problems that we've been talking about. So our challenge has been presented to us in very articulate ways. There's some interesting remedies and recommendations for action and priorities. I want to thank Mandeep and Tess and Maya and Joel and my other team, Killian and others, for pulling this all together and joining us. Thank you all for coming online for this activity. We'll be sending a recording around and a summary to everyone who registered. And with that, I will sign off. Stay tuned. Good luck. Be safe. Thank you.